We're actually just under the threshold for avoiding an automatic recount, so I'm hopeful that in the days ahead we will get there and we'll have the final official results sooner rather than later.
Well, you are listening to, most likely, Seattle's next mayor-elect, Katie Wilson, speaking to the media on Tuesday night after incumbent Mayor Bruce Harrell staked out an 8-point lead last Wednesday after Election Day. Her numbers have roared back. Are we headed toward a recount? Some thoughts there. Also, the top civilian leaders at the Seattle Police Department have been fired. What does that mean for the future of the SPD? And oh yeah, we're right in the middle of budget season for the city of Seattle. What were people sounding off about in the last public hearing? All these stories and so much more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I've just been looking at all the election coverage that you've been on over the past week. Did you ever think there would be this much math in news reporting?
Yeah, I know. I have my calculator out every day, which is not my strength necessarily, so it feels a little uncomfortable. But we have a few people look at it, and yeah, it's a quick dash to try and figure out who gets what percentage. And
yep,
it's something we do every election, but it just happens to matter a lot this one.
That's right. Kids, make sure you bring a calculator with you if you don't do well in algebra. It's an important safety note. David, thank you so much as always. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to all the patrons of the show, paid patrons, and this just starts at $5 per month. They get access to Patrons First podcast before anybody else, and even your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. I'm also cooking up a Patrons Appreciation event. Stay tuned for more information on that. But please get in on the fun. Go to Patreon online, support Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, thank you for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All righty then, let's get rolling. Time for Right Here, Right Now. All right, David, back to that math lesson, if we can, with the mayor's race. As of Wednesday morning, it looks like Katie Wilson is, and I'm going to quote one of your tweets here, almost certainly Seattle's next mayor. She had a 91-vote lead on Monday night, coming back from that 8-point deficit last week, then extended her lead to 1,346 votes. And those exact numbers are very important because if this race finishes with under a 2,000-vote lead for either candidate, that triggers a machine recount less than 150. It's a hand recount. I think I have those numbers right, David. It just feels like that traditional left-leaning swing with later voters really kicked in hard this year.
Yeah, on the recount piece, it has to be less than 2,000 and less than a half a percentage point. So in Seattle, that actually means the number is probably fewer than, say, like 1,400, 1,500 votes.
Oh,
something
wow.
like that.
Okay.
It's actually less. So I think right now the margin separating them is 0.49. So if Wilson does as well in these last 1,400 up to maybe 1,700 ballots that she did yesterday, probably it actually puts it out of that machine recount. There's some question about how many, quote, challenged ballots might end up getting counted. So there's about 1,500 of those now. Some of those will be fixed by the voters. Wilson's campaign has been kind of working to do that. So we're unclear how many total ballots we'll end up with here in the end. But, with only about 1,400 left for sure to be counted and a 1,300 or so gap between the two, at this point, it's getting pretty close to statistically impossible for Harrell to make up the ground. And, he hasn't conceded and she hasn't declared victory yet, which is why all of our headlines say likely and almost certainly. We haven't quite tipped into the realm of saying for sure, but I think there's a decent chance that after today's ballot count, we will be able to say that.
Wow, that calculator is burning in your pocket. I can sense it from here. But I guess I'm looking at this idea here. How frustrating is it that these election night numbers in some of these races, not all of them to be sure, but certainly in this race here, those election night numbers just seem to be a very inaccurate predictor of what the final result will be. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's frustrating for the general public, perhaps. It's certainly frustrating for national observers every single election.
Some of them actually called this race in favor of Harrell very early, which was not accurate.
Right. Yeah. Decision Desk HQ, which is a pretty respected operation. And in fact, I think KUW contracts with them to do election forecasting. They called the race on, I think it was Friday, maybe Thursday. And we saw some other national pundits. I think I saw David Axelrod, Obama's former campaign manager, saying on TV that Wilson had lost. And, so I think that's kind of where where it gets dicey is people who don't really understand just how dramatic these late ballot flips are.
Yeah.
As somebody who's been doing it for a while, sure, I guess I would prefer to know on election day. I don't. Usually it's only a question for a couple days. It's rare that we get into this kind of territory where
Right.
here we are a week out from election day and are only just now kind of starting to speak with a little bit more confidence about who's going to win. I think it is just the function, as a state and as a city, we have just decided that it's worth it for us to have mail-in ballots and easy ballot access. And the price we pay is not always knowing exactly what the result is on election day.
Right.
It is fascinating that it really only is Seattle and to a slightly lesser extent, King County, where we see this kind of dramatic shift. In fact, statewide, I think the later ballots tend to skew a little more conservative.
Interesting.
So, it's this quirk of Seattle that is so consistent at this point that anyone who pays any sort of attention to city politics knows to expect it. It's why Bruce Harrell was not particularly celebratory on
Yeah.
election night. He knew that, he was right in that margin at being about 7 points up on election night,
Right.
where it truly was a little hard to know exactly how it was going to turn out. So, I think on a local level, we all appropriately hedge. It's just, if you're somebody who's just tuning into the city politics now, it can be a little frustrating.
Yeah, I hear you. Were you surprised that that swing went as far as it did? And I know that Wilson had a similar swing, I think, actually during the primary just a few months ago. So maybe it wasn't that much of a surprise, but we're talking about potentially about 8 points, maybe 8.5 here that she made up. Too big to, or is that a big number to you? A little number? How do you look at that?
No, I wasn't surprised. I actually, I think if you were to take, the city's most, it's interesting because these late vote swings correlate to how progressive or conservative the candidates are truly perceived. It's actually quite nuanced, So in races where it's like Shama Sawant versus say Egan Orion. So this is as far left as you can get in city politics versus somebody who is kind of bred and chosen by the Seattle Chamber of Commerce
Yeah, right.
race.
Yeah,
That race swung, I think, by like 14 points. So
yeah,
we have seen kind of pretty massive swings. The reason why this one was so uncertain to me and why it's going to end up being so close is Bruce Harrell tends to do better. The stereotype of Bruce Harrell is that he's, quote, moderate or centrist or business
sure.
candidate,
Right.
whatever. That has never really been totally true.
True. Yeah.
He has always outran and performed better than, say Sarah Nelson or Ann Davison, people who
Yeah.
are kind of seen as these truly centrist by Seattle standards
Yes.
candidates.
Right.
Harrell has always kind of outperformed that. And so that for me, I wasn't sure, 8 points was kind of, if I were to set an over under, I would have probably set it at about 8 points of
Yeah.
he would land. I really was a coin flip for me, whether the swing would be bigger or larger than that. It's
Right.
going to turn out to be pretty much exactly that, maybe 8.5
Yeah.
points. So no, if I had to guess, this is probably about where I would have thought the swing would have ended up.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to watch that happen there. But yeah, this is what we got, folks, and we'll have some better answers later on this week as to where that goes. But it looks like Katie Wilson is going to be our next mayor. And I did want to fast forward just a little bit with you here, David. So let's say a few months from now, Katie Wilson is in office as Seattle's next mayor. And my main question really is, who is she going to surround herself with in terms of staff? And I say that because I'm thinking of the major turnover on the city council a couple of years ago. 5 new council members were voted in. Another was appointed shortly after. There just isn't a lot of long-term institutional knowledge around. Maybe you got Dan Strauss, the only member who's been there one full term before he was reelected in 2023. Maybe you could lean on an experienced person like Deborah Juarez in D5, but she's only an interim, gone in just over a year from now. My take is this is just a very green, relatively inexperienced city government when Katie Wilson takes office. What will that mean in terms of simply getting things done?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big question mark and a big challenge. And, there's zooming out even a little further. I, this is very much inside baseball, but I do think it's relevant, which is between Ed Murray to Jenny Durkin to Bruce Harrell, they kind of, of course they were all different mayors and different candidates, but they kind of enjoyed the same base of support from a lot of the same institutional players. And therefore, their offices had a lot of the same staff working in it. If you've been covering
Yep.
each of those mayoral administrations, you've probably seen repeat figures,
Yep.
Mike Fong, for example,
Hmm.
or I'm trying to think of some others, Tim Burgess,
Yeah.
frankly, or,
Right. Right.
there's people in that orbit and in the kind of consultant management arena that then maybe transfer into city government who
Yeah.
have kind of worked in each of those administrations. And so what is interesting about Katie Wilson is she does not come from that world at all. And so there is going to be the sort of staffing turnover that I think we haven't probably seen since Mike McGinn, which is just that none of the kind of staff, advisors, expertise, none of those people that exist in city government right now, particularly in the executive branch, are going to continue on. And so it's going to be really interesting to see not only who she staffs her own office with, but which department head she
Yeah.
chooses to keep. If I had to guess, I would say there's a pretty good chance we would see some of the kind of central council staff that worked under the city council when Lorena Gonzalez was council
Yeah.
president. I'm
Yeah.
thinking, I don't know this for sure, but I'm thinking of somebody like, this is not a name that maybe most people would know, but somebody like Esther Handy, who
Yeah.
used to be the kind of top head of the council legislative staff. She was fired by Sarah Nelson
Yep.
in a controversial decision because Nelson saw her as being kind of too progressive.
Yeah.
That's the kind of person that if I'm Katie Wilson, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to reach out to her. She
Yeah.
has a lot of city government experience, but also has a bit of a reputation as being open to progressive ideas. I think she worked for Mike O'Brien
She
at one
did
point
before that.
as
Yeah.
a council person. So, there's someone like that, or maybe some other kind of staffers. I know there was a lot of turnover on the council legislative staff, so maybe you tap those people.
Yeah.
Maybe you tap someone like Lorena Gonzalez
Right.
or Tandy Morales, or people who have been in city government when it was kind of a more progressive
Hmm.
version of City Hall, but now no longer work in city government.
Yeah.
Whether or not those people want to come back to City Hall, I don't know, is
Yeah.
another question. So that I think would be my expectation of where she would turn for expertise. Heck, who knows? Maybe she can convince Mike O'Brien to
Oh
get out
man.
of the heat pump business and come back to city government.
Yeah.
Something
He's gonna have to shave off that apocalypse beard he's got. But yeah,
I
you
think the
never
answer to
know.
that is probably no.
Yeah. Right. Well, real quick on that, David, I wanted to add to that because I hear what you're saying. She's definitely going to want to surround herself with some of these more progressive voices. But at the same token, she has said, I want to be a mayor for everybody. She's got to do some outreach into the business community, into some of these different folks like the Chamber of Commerce, like the Downtown Seattle Association. I think she's going to need to find some allies there too, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is no longer 2020, the time when we saw, Lorena Gonzalez not even bother to sit down with the Downtown Seattle Association for an endorsement interview. I think Katie Wilson is politically astute enough and not somebody who would close doors to conversations. That yes, I would expect when the Downtown Seattle Association reaches out to her that she would accept that meeting, whether or not she will, I mean, she already did, she
Yeah.
did an endorsement interview with them during the campaign. And frankly, if you read her answers to those questions, this is not Shama Sawant talking
No.
to the DSA.
No.
This is the voice of somebody who is, I think principled and knows what she wants and has a
Yeah.
vision and is sticking to that, but is not promising any kind of scorched earth on the business community or anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm frankly surprised that they gave her as poor of a rating as they did. I think it was actually more political on DSA's part than it was on hers in
Interesting.
that conversation. So yes, I think she will have those conversations. Again, I'm sort of zooming out probably too far here, but I think an interesting piece of Katie Wilson is she was elected without a lot of like major institutional
Right.
support.
Yep.
I think you could argue labor, but even that was quite late.
Yeah.
And, she has made this point to me, which is she's going to be coming into office without a lot of political debt owed to anybody,
Okay. Okay. Sure.
which I think is kind of a fascinating thing. And I do think that gives her, this is not, we can talk about mandates. This is going to be a really close election. It would be hard for anyone to
Yeah.
truly have a mandate.
Yeah.
But if she does have a mandate, it's that she did this on her own platform without kind of bending to any institutional pressure. And I think that does give her a lot of latitude in that she can work with anybody she wants, but she doesn't really owe any institution all that much for getting her elected.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great observation there. I take those far out zooms. I think there's a lot to be mined there in terms of information about what's next for this campaign. Thank you very much for that, David. All right, well, coming up, a shakeup at the Seattle Police Department. What's going on? We'll tell you more coming up on Now Hear This. Well, some news that might have flown under your radar during election coverage here. Seattle Police Chief Sean Barnes has fired the top two civilians working at the SPD. That would be the department's chief operating officer, Brian Maxey, and general counsel, Rebecca Boatwright. The SPD has not given any reason as to why they've been let go, as reported in the Seattle Times. I did talk with Chief Barnes a few months ago on Seattle Channel, shortly after he was hired to be the new chief of the SPD. I asked him broadly about what he wanted to change, what he wanted to do differently at the department. Here's a short clip of what he said.
And my philosophy about it is simple. People do not fear change, they fear loss. And so when you're trying to change something or you're trying to make a correction, you have to be able to talk to people and ask them, what are you afraid of losing? Sometimes it is about losing a part of their culture. It's about losing some authority. It's about sharing responsibility, losing those things. But at the end of the day, if it's going to make you safer and make your job meaningful, then that's what we're going to push forward with.
So, David, these were two experts within the SPD who were let go, especially when it came to navigating an exit from the federal consent decree the department was under, which was lifted back in September. Was this, now that the consent decree is done, hey, we don't need these people? Or do you have any idea why Boatwright and Maxey were let go?
There's chatter and rumor and stuff that, people speculate off the record that I don't feel confident enough to voice too publicly. But, I think, honestly, if Barnes had come in and done this in the first month, I don't, it would have been notable, but I don't know that anyone would have made all that big of a deal out of it because it is, if you're hired to run a department, it's kind of your prerogative to bring in the people that you want. And,
Yep.
Both Maxey and Boatwright have been basically in their respective roles since 2015. So if you are coming in and you want a new culture in the department, it certainly follows that you might want, in addition to new sworn leadership, you might want new civilian leadership.
Yeah.
I think what kind of really stood out to this is about this is the timing in two respects. One, as you mentioned, the fact that the department is now out of the consent decree. I think the good faith interpretation is that he genuinely wanted somebody who kind of knew how to navigate that process. It is a cold reward to be fired after finishing that. The other timing piece, though, is that's hard to ignore, is that it happened the Wednesday morning after the election. We don't know for sure. It's hard to imagine that Mayor Harrell didn't have some heads up that this was going to happen. It's also hard to fully convince myself that it's a coincidence that this happened the day after the election.
Yeah.
So there's that piece to it. Also, I know that Maxey and Boatwright didn't always see eye to eye with the mayor's office. There was some frustration there. I think they felt like the department was blamed for things that wasn't always the department's fault.
Okay.
I don't know that there was always great communication between the two.
All right.
I don't know if it was Mayor Harrell's decision or if he had any say in it, but I also know that he probably could have put a stop to it if he really felt strongly about it, and it is apparent that he didn't do that. Other folks have reported on some sort of kind of policy disagreements among them. So frankly, I'm still not entirely sure. I do think it is a watermark for a department that is in pretty significant flux still.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to go down this path a little further. You brought this up earlier. Again, assuming Katie Wilson does become our next mayor, does she stick with Sean Barnes as chief? I know it would be a really big move, but she could make some changes there if she wanted to.
She could, yeah. She told me in the summer, I think this was right after the primary, that she was leaning honestly towards keeping Sean Barnes, which I think at the time and probably still today is a calculation that, finding a new police chief is among the hardest staffing decisions that a mayor can make. Generally it involves a nationwide search. It can go on for months and months. There's more of a public process involved than for other department heads.
Yeah.
And so, the question I think for Wilson is that how she wants to spend basically her first 6 months in office? Figuring that out.
Right.
I think the answer, it's not really why she won. She
Yeah.
probably won more on affordability. So I think
Yep.
the answer is probably no. There's also the question of, fair or not, Katie Wilson is gonna have, she has spoken about defunding the police in the past. There's a
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
of who could she get that's better than Sean Barnes, who would want to move across the country to work for Katie Wilson. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
At the same time, she has spoken critically of Sean Barnes in the past.
Hmm.
He made a decision recently to elevate this guy, Mike, I don't know how to say his name, Teachin, something like that,
Oh,
to
yeah. Hmm.
lead the East Precinct. Teachin had a kind of gnarly history of calling protesters cockroaches and some inflammatory anti-LGBTQ statements.
Mm.
Um, Barnes backtracked on that decision, but Katie Wilson sent out some social media stuff saying, this is the wrong choice. This wouldn't
Yeah.
happen under my mayor administration. So it just kind of comes down to is Sean Barnes good enough for Katie Wilson?
Mm.
I don't know the answer to that. I think we'll learn probably not now, but in the first month or two of her administration, whether or not the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of scrambling going on in her camp right now in terms of where do we go? What connections do they have? As you mentioned earlier, they don't have as many of those political debts to pay, but there may not be as many of those political connections too to find these different leaders, like new police chiefs, et cetera.
Right.
Great observations there. I did want to touch briefly on another issue making some waves this week. This is closer to Olympia, but definitely with some statewide implications here. A policy discussion over how public records are released or not released, as is often the case. Attorney General Nick Brown held a public meeting last week to get some feedback on this. I should point out this is all in response to a petition submitted by the Seattle Times and other news outlets in the last year, looking for some new guidelines due to long delays in receiving records on what would appear to be fairly standard government activity. And David, I know you can't speak for the Times in any legal respect here, but just as a reporter, can you discuss some of the frustrations that you have had trying to get public records over the year? I'm focusing on the state to start here.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of records requests to the state, frankly, because it's not my beat. I did a bit when I was on transportation. I
Right.
think my sense is the major frustration for reporters around here was in the legislative branch of lawmakers serving in that caucus refusing to release records or finding out weird exemptions, however it might be. And that I know is frustrating. At the local level in Seattle, the main frustration is, I don't know that I've run into any behavior that I would call illegal or even unethical exactly, but the big problem is just time. It just
Yeah.
takes forever for stuff. And I would also say maybe a overly broad interpretation of what is, quote, deliberative. This is this catch-all term, which is basically if the records involve some kind of policy discussion that has not been resolved,
Yeah.
that gives officials a lot of leeway to withhold those records and not give them to you.
Mm.
For my money, I find that way too broad and frankly kind of silly. I mean, why would we
Mm.
not want to know
Of course.
what sort of policy discussions lawmakers are having?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the real challenge is time. That often, a lot of the time, by the time you actually get the records you want, the story has evolved or changed or moved past, and they're no longer relevant. And
Right.
the people who miss out are the public and our readers.
Yeah, for sure. And just some background here, folks. We do have a Public Records Act, which is on the books, has been since voters approved it back in 1972. But I just wanted to look back here, David, because at that time we did not have the massive amounts of electronic communication that we have now. So the state has actually been auto-deleting some of these text records, et cetera, after just 7 days, which appears to have slashed hundreds of thousands of public records in the last few years. That's led to some lawsuits against the state, a lot of frustration here. It just seems like a big mess to me, David, and there were a lot of different opinions reported at the public hearing on this last week. Do you see this issue as something that the AG can actually handle with a rulemaking process, or does it need to go through the legislature again? Maybe even get some sort of public vote on it? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the problem here is that built into these deliberations is an inherent conflict of interest, which is that the people making these decisions, however well intended they may be, are the sorts of people whose information is most likely to be disclosed if they open up the Records Act to be more, willing. Which is why the Seattle Times in the past has always been pretty forward and aggressive in suing, frankly,
Yeah.
and bringing litigation to these matters because, it's all well and good for Nick Brown and the legislature to say that they want to legislate this stuff or make new rules about it. But I have to ask, like, what is the motivation? What is the
Yeah.
motivation there for them to actually do that? Because the more of their records they're disclosed, the kind of more reputational liability that they possibly have. And
Oh, yeah.
so I think, unfortunately, the most effective way to ensure that these laws are being followed to the spirit of them is through
Yeah.
litigation. It's just most people, even the Seattle Times, which is sort of the biggest news institution in the state,
Yeah.
even we don't have endless resources to fight this kind of stuff.
Right. Right.
Let alone if you're, whatever, Erica Barnett or
Yeah.
somebody who's just running your own operation.
Yeah.
It's not like you can just spend half your salary on hiring a lawyer, going or all your time to go
Yeah.
fight these records battles in court. And
Right.
and I think again, whether it's ill-intended or not, I do think the city and the state know this, which is the odds that a decision that is not in keeping with the Public Records Act actually gets challenged in
Yeah.
the legal sense is quite low. Most of us will probably just move on to whatever else we have going on in our busy
Yeah.
lives rather than
Right.
spend time fighting over records that may or may not actually tell us anything all that interesting.
Yeah.
And I think there's a calculation there and an understanding that the vast majority of the time, if you withhold records that you should not have, you're probably going to get away with it, and that's just kind of the unfortunate reality.
Yeah. No, thank you for breaking that down. There's a lot behind that story. So we'll see what happens with the AG's office, maybe even the legislature in months to come. All right. Well, coming up, some back and forth on the city council's budget process, the final public hearing of the year on this. We're talking about a $9 billion package here nearly. We got some details coming up on what's next. Well, folks, the Seattle City Council is getting closer to the deadline to approve the 2026 budget. Going to happen in the next couple of weeks here. The council held its final public hearing on this issue last week. A number of different concerns raised, and one that drew dozens of commenters, David, I wanted to talk to you about, a concern over tenant services. This includes helping people pay their rent, also funding for legal services, too. If you'll remember, folks, last year, Mayor Harrell's proposal cut about $1 million from the budget for tenants. Now, Councilmember Rink is sponsoring a measure to bring a good portion of that funding back. I wanted to talk about this because, as we've talked about before on the podcast, there was some movement by former Councilmember Kathy Moore over the last few months here. She actually stepped down from her D5 job earlier this year. She wanted to make some changes to Seattle's tenant landlord laws, possibly making it easier to evict tenants. That didn't come through. I just wanted to follow that train of thought. And do you see the council putting more funding into tenant services this year, kind of laying down that card? What do you think?
Yeah, I think probably because it's in keeping with kind of the politics of Seattle. I think it's good politics in Seattle to be seen as pro tenant. It does kind of get at this larger conversation though that has been unfolding among developers or landlords for sure, but also affordable housing developers, which is where are resources best spent. I think both at the state and local level there has been a lot of emphasis put on, say, legal defense for
Yes.
evictions. And, if you talk to people in the affordable housing world, they say, this is kind of frustrating because we're spending a lot of money on lawyers for people to keep from being evicted. And then that slows us down the whole process. So people who should actually be evicted, they can't do it because it's so backlogged and so on and
Yeah.
so forth. Why are we not just taking that money and giving it to the tenants
Yeah.
who really are behind on their rent? And it's a much more, and this budget proposal does have more rental assistance that's
Yes.
separately from that. And so that it does kind of get at this bigger debate over, why, some people see it as a value added thing to be sort of building up a regulatory framework around what it means to be a tenant.
Mm.
The people who are landlords, particularly in affordable housing spaces, are frustrated with that and just see it as simpler and more straightforward to take all of that time and money and energy and just dump it into, if someone truly can't pay their rent for legitimate reasons, let's just give them some money. Let's take all that money and just funnel it right to those people. We see that as a win-win. I think it's a good argument, but one that is being taken up. I do think that's probably why these tenant services got cut in the first place, to have that extra money that they could just send directly to renters.
Right.
But again, it is sort of an ethos in Seattle to have this support system that goes beyond just writing checks.
Yeah, and do you see this turning into a bigger issue as we're assuming here Katie Wilson takes office as mayor? Of course, she's a major advocate for affordability, a big part of her campaign, a renter herself. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Wilson was one of the backers of a lot of the tenant landlord regulations that passed the more progressive city council. She was on record as being a formal lobbyist for some of them. In the times, I think the thing about Wilson that maybe sometimes get lost in the fairly unnuanced public debates is she is somebody who revisits things.
Yeah.
I think to some people's mind to a fault that she's a very much on the one hand,
yes, does that a lot
type of person. She says that a lot. And so, she is somebody who pushed for a lot of these landlord-tenant regulations that now a lot of landlords are really chafing against.
Yeah.
And we've written stories about the challenges in the affordable housing sector. When I have talked to her, she has actually shown a willingness to revisit some of those regulations and is open to the idea that they are causing more harm than good, though she certainly hasn't committed. So, again, I just think we're going to really learn a lot about her pretty quickly because unlike on the campaign trail, at a certain point, you do have to just pick a lane and stick to that. And that'll be interesting to see which of those, how Katie Wilson as mayor approaches these landlord-tenant issues.
Yeah, I know it's been something that's been cooking around Seattle City Hall for the past year plus here. So I did need to wrap up with you here, David. And one last manners question as we finish. Is it a nice gesture to bring leftover Halloween candy into your workplace or a cruel thing to do to people who are already dreading putting on extra pounds before the holidays? What do you got?
Well, my neighbor gave each of my children an entire bag of candy for
Oh,
Halloween.
no.
Keep in mind that my kids are 1 and 3, so they are not eating candy. So I did this on election night. I brought in all of their candy, save for a couple pieces for my 3-year-old, and put it on the snack table, and all of it got eaten. So whether people say they don't want it or not, I know deep in our hearts people really want it.
Yeah, and I've got an idea. I'll work it out with you at some point, a movie script here, like the best way to poison and destroy like news media around the country. Just put a plate of brownies in, like in every newsroom around the country. You'd take them all out.
Instantly.
Sad but true. Sad but true. All right. Well, thank you, David. As always, thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. If you want to be a patron and support the show, well, I really think you should. Go to Patreon online, find Seattle News, Views, and Brews, pledge $5 per month or more, and thank you for the support. You can hear this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.